Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-host John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Please check out our friends from radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes of the show on our website irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. John has also set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story. And if you care to contribute to that, we would really appreciate it. Now, on today's episode of the show, we are joined by Colonel Gareth Prendergast, the author of Clear, Hold and Build. Colonel Prendergast is Head of Strategic Force Design for the Irish Defence Forces. Colonel Prendergast, you're very welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here, Cathal.
Now, could you tell us why you wanted to write the book, Clear, Hold and Build?
I've been asked this question a lot recently, and I haven't really thought about it because I just did it. But around 12 years ago, in 2012, 13 years ago now, I was sent on my command and staff course to the US Command and General Staff School in America. And it was at the time when the Iraq War was just finishing up and the Afghan War was still going on. So a lot of my classmates had all fought in those conflicts. So counterinsurgency was a very, very big topic of discussion that we did during the year that I spent over there in America. And it was a fantastic opportunity. And then when I came home, I worked in my own military college then to try and teach what I had learned for the year over there. And I remember reading Sean Boyne's excellent book on Emmett Dalton. And as I read through the book, all the areas on counterinsurgency that I had learned in America, including post-nation support, civil control, civil security, restoration of essential services, all started popping up in the book. Because I also forgot to add that one of the electives, and this is unusual in America that we did, because I did a master's in military arts and science over there, was on counterinsurgency in Ireland. And throughout that, it's unusual to be taught your own history in an outside country and by outside people who don't have the biases that you have, that we all had through the education system in Ireland. So I found that very refreshing. So with that in mind, and after reading Sean Boyne's book on Emmett Dalton, I said, I'm going to try and write a book on the Civil War. Well, I try and do my PhD first on it and have a subject and then hopefully convert it into a book. As to say, what really happened at the strategic level in the Civil War, because everyone has their opinions, but I've tried to break it down as what did they do that actually allowed them to turn the tactical victories into strategic success. So that's where I came about, because I thought it would be a very good case study for the Americans and for people in Ireland to study, because it just shows the doctrine of clear, hold, build that we were being instructed at the time, how it actually happened and how it worked in a certain circumstance, because everyone is looking for case studies where it worked. And I believe the Irish Civil War is a very good case study for that.
For the listeners who are not well versed in military theory, what is counterinsurgency and how does it apply to the Irish Civil War?
Thanks very much for that, John. An insurgency is basically it's bigger than terrorism. It's where there's an insurgent force is grown up within a country and they want separation, either from a colonial power or from the government forces, or it could be ideological, it could be communist, or it could be based politically, or it could be based on so many different areas. And they just basically want to break away and be an insurgent force. And it's the precursor to independence. So counterinsurgency is how do you counter that insurgency? So this grew up, it was called small wars doctrine years ago, and then it was counter-revolutionary warfare, the British called it. And then the Americans came in and they didn't really like the counter-revolutionary word because of their revolutionary wars were quite historic for them. So they came up with the terminology counterinsurgency. Malaya would have seen it happening in the 1950s. A lot of it happened after World War II. So you have your Malayas, you have your Vietnams, you have all those insurgencies and then the counterinsurgency force. You have conventional war, which is state against state, blue against blue or blue against red forces. And insurgency is different because the insurgents live amongst the people, amongst the population. And how do you counter that? It's normally a smaller force. They don't have an air force or a navy per se. So how does a large power counter that? And we saw in the Vietnam War, the Americans couldn't figure out how to counter that. And in Iraq, it was similar. How we can beat the conventional forces of Saddam Hussein, but it was the insurgency that they found the most difficult. So how do you fight an insurgency? And an insurgency normally comes from amongst the population. So it's not just the insurgent forces you have to defeat. You have to defeat them and discredit them from the population. So that's the whole idea of clear whole builds. The clear element is, if we look at the Iraq War, the clear element is where you clear the forces. So the Americans cleared their whole way from the southern border all the way up to Baghdad, and then they started clearing the areas afterwards. It was the holds that they found most difficult because they could do the clear with 200,000, say, soldiers. But to hold that terrain after they've cleared it takes a considerable more amount of forces because you have to leave stay-behind forces or else there's a vacuum going to be created. Because once you move on, the insurgents or the enemy forces are going to come back into the population. And then to turn the tide of the war, it is the population is the sea that the insurgent swims in, that you have to win the population over. And that's where the build comes into play. You have to build the confidence of the population. You have to restore the essential services. You have to build governance. You have to build the economy, and you have to win over the population. Hearts and minds is what it was called during the Vietnam War. Now they're saying hearts and minds is probably a little bit too, how would I say, nice or fuddy-duddy. So now there has to be sort of a more compellence level included in the build phase of it, so that you have to do the hearts and minds, and you also have to carry the big stick along with the carrot. So that's it in a nutshell, John.
As regards Ireland in the early 20th century, obviously you have an insurgency, to use that term, against British rule in the War of Independence period, and then, I guess, by a section of the movement against the new Free State government. So I suppose the first question, actually, if we could just diverge a little bit from your book, Gareth, like, I mean, the British failed at counterinsurgency by that measure. Like, they didn't manage to crush the separatist movement or the Republican movement at that time. So, first of all, maybe we could look at that a little bit. Why didn't the British succeed with overwhelming force that they could have had?
Yeah, and this is the whole element of my book, in that I sort of put it back to the Lawrence of Arabia quote, let the Arabs do it intolerably, and it's better than us doing it ourselves. Because the British were a foreign occupying force that was in Ireland that tried its best to ingratiate itself with the population. The best thing that they had with the population was the RIC, and they were their eyes and ears. And by the time of the War of Independence, the RIC was predominantly Catholic and from Ireland. So the IRA blinded the RIC throughout the conflict. I mean, you can see hundreds being killed or injured. And then we have the British try to reinforce those with the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, and the war became that and the IRA per se. But the British ultimately failed because they didn't know what was going on amongst the population. They didn't have the cultural awareness of Ireland. They didn't understand the society and the breakdown of Irish life. And that's where a lot of the occupying forces fail in Vietnam, fail in Iraq, in Afghanistan. They don't know what the culture is. And that's why they try to recruit a host nation force. We see it in Vietnam, they had the South Vietnamese army. We see it in Afghanistan, where the Afghan National Army. We even see it in Lebanon, where the Israelis tried to recruit the South Lebanese army to try and bring in that power into a country, and then they support that. The British never had that in Ireland, and that the Irish people didn't allow them. Like, they had the RIC, which was predominantly Irish, that had a lot of Irish regiments in the British Army, but they didn't serve in Ireland. So what I'm saying is that when the Irish came into it, and if you look at the forces, by the time the Civil War finished, there was 60,000 or 55 to 60,000 in the Free State Army. When the British left in October 21, they had 57,000 in Ireland. So the amount of forces were nearly the same in each country. But what I'm saying in my book is that by recruiting Irish soldiers into the Free State Army, they understood the general dynamics of Irish society. And this is the discussion we had on the review, in that, yes, the Civil War in Cork was completely different than the Civil War in Kerry, because Cork was a 50-50 county. So by the time the 800 Dublin Guards landed into Cork City and Passage West in August 1922, Within 8 to 10 months, that was converted to 5,500 Free State soldiers in Cork, the majority of them locally recruited. So they knew the area, they knew the personalities, they knew the characters, they knew the societies. I think it was Ernie O'Malley or those said, they knew who we were, like they knew who the leaders of the IRA were, where the British never fully comprehended who the leadership of the IRA were throughout the War of Independence. Whereas you look at Kerry, the National Army became an occupying force. And this is the danger, and I've had it at the start of my book, and John Nagle picks up on it. If you win and you do the clearance operations, you cannot suddenly then turn from a force of liberation into an occupying force. That's what happened in Iraq in 2003, 2004. In Cork, they managed that balancing act. In Kerry, they didn't. They became an occupying force in Kerry because 75% of the National Army, the Free State Army in Kerry, was from outside Kerry. They could only recruit at least 25% locally into the National Army. And that's why we have a lot more atrocities in Kerry than we have in Cork. So the key to it was, I would say the Civil War would have went on continuously in Kerry, but in the other counties in Munster, they had managed to placate it, especially in Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Clare, Tipperary. But Kerry, they could never recruit locally. And that's why that conflict became a lot more contentious and vicious than the civil wars that we had. Like, I think 20% of the full Free State Army was in the Cork-Kerry area during the Civil War, and the majority of the National Army bases were in those areas. So yes, you could say my book features on the Munster area, but that was the decisive operation. You can see Richard Mulcahy's writing saying that we have the Civil War pretty much sorted in the rest of the country. Obviously, there's areas like Mayo and Sligo going on, but Cork, Kerry, Waterford, Limerick, Clare, Tipperary, they were the main fighting areas after the clearance phase.
I strongly agree, really, with all what you're saying, Gareth. I mean, my only disagreement with you, I think, is also kind of agreeing with you, where, I mean, I think that the Free State victory in the Civil War is 90% about their political credibility and their advantageous position, because it is part of the Republican movement that accepts the treaty. And I'm not so sure about like the tactical excellence of the National Army in counterinsurgency would be my kind of disagreement with you.
No, I actually agree with you 100%. I agree with you. Tactically, they made a lot of mistakes. And some of the leadership that they had in, like the Battle of Kilmallock, 2,000 Free State soldiers against 1,000 IRA, I would say Liam Deasy was the far better commander in the field than W.R.E. Murphy, because he was too ponderous. So they did make a lot of mistakes, the Free State Army, but what they had behind them, and this is the whole essence of my book, is that they managed a strategic victory. And this is where, in Vietnam, the famous quote, the American general says to the Vietnamese guy, "You never bet us in battle." Yeah, but we won the war. So, all the tactical victories that you have, they say the tactical victories decide engagements. Engagements decide the strategic success of who's going to win the war. So we're actually in violent agreement on this, John, and that they had the political know-how, and they reinforced that by the build phase. And that's what a lot of people are finding unusual about my book, is that I've looked at it. And a quote is that 20% of counterinsurgency is military, 80% is everything else. You have to win the population over. You have to show them they are a better alternative. Ireland at this stage had gone through 10 years of conflict, John. They were tired. The population were tired. What they had to do was discredit the IRA leadership, the Dan Breens, the Tom Barrys, the Liam Lynches. They had to remove them from the population because the insurgent swims in the population. That's the sea, according to Mao. So they had to remove that. I don't know how they knew how to do that. That's the whole beauty behind it. How do they know how to do this? Because the writings of Mao and all these Galula and Tronquier were 50 years after the Irish Civil War, but they just knew it through common sense. So they used the information ops. I have a whole chapter on information operations, how they discredited the IRA leadership and how they removed them from the population. And they did this because, as you know yourself, after the IRA seized the up north, I got 80 tons of explosives. And you see Pam Murray writing to Liam Lynch saying, okay, they've beaten us conventionally, so our best option is to make governance impossible. Let's blow up all the infrastructure. Yeah, to a degree that worked, but it also alienated them from the population because they were blowing up bridges and railway infrastructure that was affecting the local population. Like, if you go into the Collins Barracks Museum and you'll see a notebook in Michael Collins's pocket when he was shot, And when you flick through the notebook, you see visiting the banks on the South Mall now with Dalton, and they're going in and freezing all the IRA bank accounts, like a modern day cab equivalent. Must get on to Brennan. And when I researched Brennan was Patrick Brennan, who worked in Dublin Castle, and he went down, he was a forensic accountant, and he froze all the IRA. And that forced the IRA out to commandeer from the population then and to tax the population. And as someone says, not even in the times of the War of Independence did the IRA treat us like this, because they basically put a block between the IRA and the population. That's all part of the build. And the build is also, you inspire confidence then with the population. You don't have to win them over, John. They just have to tolerate you and see, okay, you're a better alternative than the chaos that we have. They're providing economy, they're providing jobs, they're providing some form of local governance. We can go in and we can complain. They're giving us some, I know the Sinn Féin courts were there, but they're giving us a judicial system. And that's the key to a counterinsurgency. And that's how you turn the tactical victories. Even though they didn't have as many tactical victories as they probably could have, the National Army probably lost more fatalities than the IRA did. But strategically, it was the builds that won them the war ultimately. I know it's quite a contentious thing, because a lot of people are saying to me, well, did the Free State really win the Civil War? So I'm saying, well, read my book and make up your own mind.
When you were doing your research and you were looking at other books written about the Civil War, did you find that the theories that you're talking about counterinsurgency and looking at other counterinsurgencies in different eras in different countries, was any of those theories ever taken on board by different authors when they're looking at the Irish Civil War?
Not really. If they did it, Colin, it was done sort of unbeknownst to themselves. And that was the whole Sean Boyne book, that when I was reading about Emmett Dalton, all the stuff about host nation support and rebuilding the infrastructure. And a lot of people were saying this was a good idea, that they restored the railway infrastructure, but they never linked it to a theory that I had linked it to. And some people say, God, does it work having this? I called it the Peaky Blinders, Peaky Blinders, where you have a historical thing, but modern music interleaved through it. That's what I was trying to do, in that, okay, here's the historical stuff. And by the way, this is the theory behind it all. This is why it worked. So that was the whole, and it caused me a bit of trouble at the first few years with my supervisors, because they were purely historians, and I says, no, it will work, believe me, because a lot of people thought I was trying to ram square pegs into round holes. But eventually, after 2-3 years, they sort of said begrudgingly, yeah, I think it's working, Gareth, I think it's working. And I just kept on going with that, because it was just the mindset and the education that I had got. I wanted to show, and I wanted to give credit to the leadership of the Free State. And actually, I was a little bit biased at the start of my studies. So my supervisors also told me to look at the other side. And I did, because I wanted to be unbiased. And I have to say, I drew an awful lot of credit and admiration for some of the leaders on the IRA side that were pretty much written out of history too. The Ernie O'Malley's and the Liam Deasy's. You see them writing to Liam Lynch saying, what's the strategy behind this? We need a strategy to win over the population. The population are going to support our tactical actions, but what's the overall end state? What's the vision that we want to achieve? And they never gave that to the population. And that's where the population eventually says, well, if we don't know where you're going, then we'll go on this side here, because it's just easier and we're just tired of warfare.
One thing, Gareth, listening to you speak, occurs to me, and has occurred to me throughout researching, the revolutionary period, is that the likes of Richard Mulcahy and Liam Lynch and others did have a very solid grasp on the idea of irregular warfare. I think, they were very unromantic about it. As Chief of Staff of the IRA in the pre-truce period, Mulcahy writes, for example, to people in the west of Ireland, saying, there's no point in attacking barracks if you're going to get killed or captured. That's not what we're about. It's about controlling the population. Find out who's in sympathy, get rid of the ones who are not. And he's very ruthless about it. But they know it's, they instinctively grasp the idea that it's about controlling the population. And as regards Lynch in the Civil War, I think it's a very bad strategy, but I do think Lynch had a strategy, which is to make civil governance impossible. So it's the opposite of the Free State strategy, if you like, to destroy the infrastructure, to burn down the tax office, to stop people collecting tax. I do think that people on both sides had a kind of instinctive grasp on this in early 20th century Ireland.
No, I take that point on board. And what the Free State did, or the National Army did, was they used Lynch's strategy against him. Because if you're going to try and make government impossible, you're going to alienate the people. So that sort of played into the National Army policy. And if you can see Richard Mulcahy, and like as divisive a character he is, he had a very, very strong vision of what he wanted to achieve. And Collins, I have to say, a lot of people write about Collins. Collins was just a fantastic strategist. He mightn't have been the best tactical commander, but he understood strategy. He understood how to get on with the British and how to get the support from them. And in fairness, you see him writing to Lloyd George and to Churchill to get them to support the policy, while also having his own policy, I believe, for Northern Ireland afterwards. But Mulcahy was very fixed in his ways, and he knew where it had to be done and where it didn't have to be done. He knew he had to recruit in the British Army officers who had fought in World War I. He had to recruit them in to give the leadership. And he says, as unpopular as they are, we need them to reorganize our army and to help us fight the war back again. Because as we know, September, October, the IRA got the momentum again after the initial clearance phases. So Mulcahy writes to the other members of the General Staff saying, we have to get these British Army veterans in to help us reorganise the army. And if you can see, and you know yourself from your research, suddenly from January onwards, report writing is a lot more professional. The leadership, the reorganisation of the National Army is a lot more professional from January onwards, because you have these guys who are properly trained officers coming in and putting a structure onto the Free State, the National Army, as per se. So I would have to give Mulcahy an awful lot of credit. Yeah, a lot of people say he was vicious, and this is the whole idea of my book, is that you're not going to win an insurgency by just hearts and minds. There has to be a kinetic, people don't like that word, but there has to be a compellence team alongside with it, that if you're not going to agree with us, then we're going to have to fight you. But it's better and it's easier for you to agree with us. And it's, as you rightly said, and as Mulcahy was writing in the War of Independence, it's winning over the population. Try not to alienate ourselves from the population, because that's the way we'll win. It's the population is the pitch that we're playing on. It's whoever wins them will win the war ultimately.
So Gareth, I was going to ask, as a soldier rather than a historian, if you're going to put on your soldier's hat for a minute, how damaging was it to the anti-treaty side that they didn't hold territory, particularly urban areas, that they seemed quite ready to abandon urban areas rather than fight during the Civil War? And
thanks for spurring me on. This is where I sort of wanted to write it from. I've read a lot of history books, and I've enjoyed a lot of history books. And as a military person who's gone through all the international courses and instructed in courses, I get a little bit pedantic when I see a word being used incorrectly, like to seize or to secure or decisive operation or turning maneuver. So as you can see throughout my book, I always put the definition of all these words beside it. So to answer your question, how damaging was it that they didn't hold terrain? I would agree with you, and John has written an excellent book, and I read it on the Civil War in Dublin, that once the IRA lost Dublin, they lost the administrative capital, they lost the press, they lost the financial backing, they lost a lot of the clergy, they lost that. So by losing Dublin, the war automatically changed, and they went down and reinforced the Munster Republic with Cork as the real capital, etc. To stay and hold the urban areas, I don't think they would have been possible to do. They tried to do that for the first couple of months of the conventional phase. The National Army had the artillery, eventually had the superior manpower, and had more guns and bullets, basically, and they conquered them. So I think the IRA actually made a mistake in trying to hold the territory too much in the first couple of months. And it was only in September, October, when they were forced into North Cork and West Cork and Kerry area, into these areas, as we say, the ungoverned spaces, that they got the momentum back again, that they reformed into their flying columns, and they went back fighting a similar type of war as they fought in the War of Independence, that they re-got the momentum. So maybe they made a mistake in trying to hold terrain, but I agree with you that by losing Dublin, that was a huge loss for them, and losing Cork as well. They lost all their tax income and their financial income by losing those two cities. And also, you see the Free State using the economy as they're moving down. You see the populations of Clonmel looking jealously at the population of Waterford, because now they see the Free State war machine coming in, and they see commerce coming in, and they see people getting war contracts to provide food to the National Army. So the people of Clonmel are saying, please take us over too, because we want a little bit of that war wealth coming into us and that market economy, because 30% of the national budget was being spent on the civil war at this time. So you see the cities and the merchant princes endlessly looking across at cities that were occupied by the National Army, wanting them to come into their area and to bring a little bit of that economy into the area. The whole policy of the National Army was then to go out and take over the towns and villages. Now, I admit I concentrated on Cork because I use Cork as the case study, as the proof of concept for the rest of Munster. Cork and Kerry were different, agreed. But what they tried in Cork, they tried in the other areas, in that they went out to the towns and villages of Ireland and they put a security situation in there. They allowed the economies, they provided what we call a safe and secure environment. They provided, and you can see the reports being written from January 23 onwards, they allowed the local population set up fairs and they provided security for these fairs and markets. They started to rebuild the bridges in the area. They started to put governance into these areas so as to make the population, the life of the population better in the areas that they were compared to the areas that the IRA were occupying. So suddenly the populations in these areas are looking and saying, hold on a second, they're better off under Free State control than we are in the ungoverned space of North Cork or West Kerry, etc. So that was a ploy that they used. So by not holding on to territory, yes, they definitely lost out. But by trying to hold on to territory for the first 3 months of the war, they received the most casualties in that. And it was only when they returned to guerrilla warfare did the IRA get the momentum back again. And for the months of September, October, November, you can see Emmett Dalton in those writings saying we've lost the momentum. The IRA have that back. And that's where my chapter on the learning organization, how the Free State had the knowledge to adjust and become a learning organization and change and reorganize how the army fought to come back in, and they got the momentum back again in 23.
In your assessment, Gareth, how serious was the threat to the Free State in that guerrilla phase? You know, some Republicans argued in retrospect that they should have ended the war after the fall of Cork, but they didn't. Of course, they embarked on a guerrilla war. And how likely or how possible do you think it was that the guerrilla war could have toppled the Free State, or at least toppled the treaty settlement?
I think it was fairly likely, but what they had to do was to get it joined up. The taking of Limerick at the very start, John, was key, because the policy of the anti-treaty side was they reinforce Cork, Munster, and they'd go up through Limerick and link up with the areas of West Connacht and then push back towards Dublin again. If that would ever have worked, I'm not sure, especially because the Free State held the artillery and had the aircraft and had not only did they have the artillery, they had the ability to fire the artillery and they had the ammunition to do it. So they had no real choice but to revert to the guerrilla tactics. It was becoming effective towards November, October, and you can see the writings of the local commanders, the local National Army commanders, that they were in a sticky situation and it was pretty much on the level. But the very fact the anti-treaty elements combined it with also the destruction of infrastructure, they were continuously alienating themselves from the population. So as they were winning the guerrilla war, they were alienating themselves from the population, which they weren't doing in the War of Independence. The population were willing to let them hide in the locations, giving them the safe houses, giving them the food. So the guerrilla warfare that they started to conduct in the Civil War, I don't think would ever have been as successful as it had been in the War of Independence, because the Free State continuously alienated them from the population. So could they have won that guerrilla warfare? I suppose they could have, if the National Army hadn't reorganized and took the war back to them in a different occasion. There could have been ungoverned spaces. Kerry, they could have held on to. West Cork, they could have held on to. How long they could have held on to as well is a key element, because they weren't getting support from any outside country. And this is the key, that in the War of Independence, they were getting a bit of support from America. They were getting weapons from the UK. The National Army knew exactly how they were getting their weapons, because they were getting them too during the War of Independence. So they clogged them up. At the start of the war, they were better armed than they were in the War of Independence because of the raid on the Upnor and Clonmel barracks, etc. But they just didn't have the ability to sustain that conflict. And I think the National Army had fought that conflict similar to them. So I think they would have eventually won in the end.
I mean, the thing is, though, that like, if you look at the ministers in the Free State government in the turn of the year, they're actually very pessimistic, because they say not so much that we'll lose this from a military point of view as the state might go bankrupt, or I think it's O'Higgins says the population might give up. So how likely is that? And also, like, Liam Lynch is, again, I think a little bit more realistic than people give him credit for. Like, he carries on the war for a very long time after it's clearly lost, but Lynch does say clearly to De Valera, the military victory is not possible. What we hope for is, a kind of a stalemate where we'll have to renegotiate the treaty. So basically, how likely is that scenario, though, where the Free State government has to go back to the British saying we may need to renegotiate the treaty and we may need to upset this settlement which we're defending?
Yeah, it is realistic, and it's a very good point. And as you said it, I was thinking of a couple of things that if the National Army had continued to alienate the population like they did in Kerry with some of the atrocities, and as in fairness to Lynch, he's saying, if we can win the war amongst the population, and if the population turned against the National Army, then pretty much, yes. The other thing that the IRA were trying to do at the very start of the Civil War was to get the British back involved in the war again, so as to unify the people. And the Four Courts was an example. It was touch and go whether the National Army was going to deal with the Four Courts, or you see Winston Churchill wanting the British to get involved in the Four Courts. So that was a key element that they were trying to do along the way, was get the British back into the war again. And the British were watching and they were equipping. And we can see in October, there was a change in government. Devonshire comes in and replaces Churchill. And now we have Devonshire actually looking for payment for the equipment, whereas Churchill was just giving them all the equipment. And now we have Devonshire writing to them looking for money to pay for all this equipment that we're giving you, because they gave them 50,000 rifles, millions of rounds of ammunition, aircraft, etc. So the Free State couldn't pay that. So they just kept receiving it and built up the bills afterwards. So one of the key elements that the IRA could have been successful if they had broken that link between the National Army, the Free State, and the British. And you can see the writings of British supporting that McKeown did well in the west of Ireland, or Dalton is doing okay in Cork. So if they had undermined the confidence of the National Army with the British, and if the IRA had come in and countered that, and then become stronger, and as you said, achieve the stalemate that the British had sort of said to themselves, well, there's no way we're going to win this war. And as you can see what's happening in modern history, what's happening at the moment is there going to be a stalemate in Ukraine? And then the West suddenly says, well, there's no point getting involved in this war anymore if it's going to be a stalemate and it's going to go on. It's going to be a frozen conflict. Then you lose the interest of the outside backers. And suddenly then, did the Free State have the ability to win the war on their own without British backing? And if the Munster Republic had succeeded, or elements of the Munster Republic had succeeded? Yeah, it's a very interesting question, John. And I would tend to agree with you that it was a good strategy. And it's amazing that Lynch recognized that strategy, but continued then to make governance impossible and blow up all the railways, and commandeer cars from the local doctors or the local priests, or take animals off the local farmers so as to feed his soldiers, So yeah, he spoke with that, and then they continued to do those stuff that alienated themselves from the population. And of course, the Catholic Church coming into it, and they pretty much controlled Ireland at that time. That was key. That was a key element to get the population and those that were sitting on the fence. Or you can see in any election or any counterinsurgency, there's always going to be 20% supporting you, 20% against you, and you have 60% in the middle ground. And it's to win that middle ground is the key. And that's what was teetering. And that's why you see O'Higgins and all those wondering towards the end of the 22, can we turn this around? And they did manage to do it in the start of 23.
Now, Gareth, as we were discussing there, the British and the British view on the whole thing, in your wider study of counterinsurgency, why do you think the Free State and the National Army was successful? Whereas, I don't know if there's a strict parallel, but you have places like Vietnam where you have the South Vietnamese army and obviously the Americans, and a place like Afghanistan where you have the British are looking for very definitely one side in this conflict to win. They would prefer the local forces rather than having to come back in and do it. Why during the Irish Civil War do you think the National Army were successful, whereas in other conflicts they failed?
That's a very good question, and that's why I want people to buy my book, Kyle, to see how they managed to do it, and they didn't do it in other countries. And I would say it's because of the National Army wanted it more than what the other countries tried to back in Vietnam or Afghanistan. Okay, fair enough. I know guys from the Afghan army that are no longer in Afghanistan that had to leave the country quite quickly. who am I to criticize the South Vietnamese army during the Vietnam War? But in Ireland's case, the National Army was set up, and it's amazing that it was only over an oath of allegiance that this whole war was fought, because partition was also there. So yeah, it's a very good point. But the very fact that the National Army had very little British support, that they weren't fighting alongside the British, that would have completely, you see in Vietnam or Afghanistan, the Afghan army trying to fight and they have the Americans beside them, and same in Vietnam. The fact that there was no British army fighting alongside the National Army, because if the British army had been fighting alongside them, it was very easy for the anti-treaty IRA to say, look, you got rid of them and now they're back and they're using these as a puppet. They tried that in their propaganda to say the Free State was a puppet of the British. But the fact that there was a lot of British military equipment in use. 50% of the National Army had fought. Now, that's a hard figure to prove because there's nothing on attestation forms. We only have small evidence that at least 50% of the National Army, but a considerable amount of the National Army had fought in World War I with the British. So now we had the guys able to use the artillery pieces, able to fix the armoured vehicles, able to man the signals equipment. So now we had sort of a proxy British army, but wearing a National Army uniform that was fighting, but still led by and whole by a purely Irish GHQ, because the majority of the GHQ hadn't served in the British Army. The majority of the GHQ had been the leadership of the IRA in the War of Independence. And the very fact that it was Irish men fighting Irish men and Irish women fighting against Irish women led and basically allowed the legitimacy of the force. And the legitimacy of the force was a key element in that you see in Afghanistan and Vietnam them trying to uphold legitimacy and non-corruption. And then behind their backs, you see the politicians heavily involved in corruption and non-legitimate actions. People, yeah, of course, you can point fingers at O'Higgins and Cosgrove and all those to say, but by and whole, they upheld the legitimacy of the treaty they believed in, and they fought for it. And there was no British involvement. There was British involvement in an indirect way, but they weren't fighting alongside the British, because if the British had come in beside them and fought with them, that was game over. But the very fact that they could fight themselves gave them the legitimacy to overall win the war. And that's why I say would be the biggest difference, that there wasn't British soldiers on the ground. It was a National Army completely supported by the British in weapons, and 50% of them might have served in the British Army before, but they were fighting under Irish uniforms and for a free state, which was, we could argue all night what was the Free State compared to Republic. It was a good alternate stepping stone, as Michael Collins said.
Well, Gareth, I was just going to ask you about the issues of morale and ideology. That if you are an anti-treaty volunteer during the Civil War, if you lose your morale or you feel like the war isn't going well, you can just sort of leave. You can leave the battlefield. But when we're looking at the National Army at that period, just the fact that it's an actual army with proper ranks and officers and barracks and all that type of stuff and a regular pay make a huge difference in terms of the war.
Oh, a huge difference. You see John Borgen overriding about that these people were getting a pay. And as we know, at the time, unemployment was quite high was quite high in Ireland. And you also had a lot of disenfranchised people. I think the 1926 or 27 census said that there was still 150,000 veterans of World War I living in the Free State. And there was another 100,000 living north of the border. And these people weren't getting the jobs. When they came home from Ireland, they weren't treated like heroes. They weren't getting the jobs in Ireland that other people were getting. And a lot of them had been killed. Over 120 of them been killed in the War of Independence for being informers to the British. So they certainly had skin in the game, and they wanted a little bit of revenge back again. They wanted to get financial remuneration. And the very fact that, okay, I'll readily agree, discipline in the National Army at the start of the conflict was not very good. And you see McMahon and Mann writing about that, saying, but by the end of the war, discipline became more instilled into the National Army. And that was the cause of the 24 Mutiny, because the junior leadership became predominantly British Army veterans. And then when they reorganized and had to downscale the army, they wanted to keep all the British Army veterans because these were professional NCOs and professional officers. And now we see the people who said, but we fought in the War of Independence for Ireland, being disenfranchised. But the very fact that they recognised they needed a disciplined army that wouldn't walk away from the field. And that's what happened to the anti-treaty side. As the war prolonged, we just see the soldiers leaving. They weren't getting paid. Their ideology went, their morale dropped. The population no longer supported them. The leadership, because a lot of them went on the anti-treaty side because they followed their leaders in First Southern and Second Southern Division. They just, who do we support? And their leadership told them who they support. So I suppose the argument is financial remuneration versus your ideology, and how long does your ideology last in a wet field in West Cork when you're not getting fed and someone's shooting at you and the discipline isn't as strong. And that's the eternal question about how do you build a professional army. And the Free State was far from a professional army at the very start, but they learned very quickly along the way. And that was the difference in the junior leadership. And now, yeah, there was soldiers and NCOs killed by their own forces, but the junior leadership of the National Army was stronger than the junior leadership of the anti-treaty IRA towards the end of the conflict. So hence, they stayed in the field longer.
Just kind of a broad question, kind of to close out the chronology, Gareth. When you're talking about strategy, as you said, it means winning the war. And first question is, what does that look like in a guerrilla war? What does it mean to win a guerrilla war if you're the government side? And the second part of the question is, how do they do it?
It basically means you've disenfranchised the other side. You have to get rid of the cause. It's all about the cause. And you have to basically discredit the cause amongst the population. You have to undermine the cause. You have to influence the networks. You have to undermine their supply chains. On all those areas I cover in the conclusion part of my book, you just basically have to undermine the cause and you have to remove them from the population. You have to remove the population support, because an insurgency will only survive if it's got the support of the population. History will prove that. If you have a crazy group of lads living in the mountains doing stuff and no one in the local population likes them, they're not going to survive. They're going to continue on in their marginalized group. You have to basically demarginalize them, remove them from the population, discredit the leadership, and provide a better alternative. The alternative mightn't be better, but it's tolerable to the population. And you have to rebuild the trust and confidence of the population. If one side is going around destroying all the infrastructure and you're going around building it again and making life better for the population, then who are the population going to support? If one side are commandeering your cattle, taking your cars, stopping trade, and you're providing markets, infrastructure to support governments, war contracts in the area, and as Bill Clinton said, it's the economy stupid, you're winning that. And another quote from Bill Clinton, and I don't want to annoy any of the leadership, is that when he was looking at the Northern Irish peace process, he said the best thing to disenfranchise a freedom fighter is to give him a job, a family, and a mortgage, because he's not going to hang around the street corners. He now has responsibilities. He's going to be less inclined to become a freedom fighter because you're giving him different priorities in his or her life. And so that's where the economy comes in. That's where you have to give the farms. That's where you have to give the markets. That's how you have to provide the governance, so that when they're down there and people be saying, oh, that's Dublin, they're trying to control us. But no, it's not Dublin. Within Bantry now we have a local government that's trying to provide road networks, sewerage systems, water schemes, etc., electricity or whatever in years to come into your area. Then they will say, hold on a second, yeah, but they're providing this. What are you providing for us? Like, what's the alternative? What do you want? And the very fact that, yeah, okay, was the Republic a realistic aspiration? And you can even see Eamon de Valera talking to Owen McNeill over a cup of tea. It's in the Royster Diaries. And he himself is saying at this moment, the Republic is not something that we can fully achieve, but it's a good starting level. So did the leadership of the IRA actually fully believe that they could get a republic after the War of Independence? So when you're sitting in a cold cave or the side of a ditch and the population is against you, the National Army know your hideouts. As we discussed earlier, there's an execution policy in that if you're caught with a weapon, you're going to be shot. As drastic as that was, it did have a huge, and I agree with you, information operations and propaganda effect on the young people. And suddenly when you see 77 or 81, the figure of people being shot and executed for having weapons, then people start thinking about themselves. Now, that execution policy, also we see Emmett Dalton writing Mulcahy and saying, I have 1,800 people in prison for holding weapons. Am I expected to shoot all of them? So that did cause a little bit of upset on the National Army side, or a lot of upset on the National Army side. But the very fact that people were being executed, and the story I love is that the Free State officer goes into the village and goes up to Mrs. Murphy and says, will you tell your son John to stop attacking the village, because your other son Michael is in prison. And if John keeps attacking, Michael will be the next person executed. And suddenly Mrs. Murphy goes up the hill and says, John, stop attacking the village because Michael's going to be executed. Only Irish people in Ireland understand that. And they were some of the key attributes that they could do that the British Army never had the possibility of doing in the War of Independence.
Now, again, it may be going back to the question of tactics versus strategy. And obviously strategy, winning the war, is the important thing. But yeah, the big disagreement I think I had when I was reading your book, Gareth, was like the idea that the National Army really improves as the war goes on. And I'm not sure that that's the case. Like it increases in size massively. Some of the officers really improve. And yes, a lot of the ones who improve are actually former British officers. But the training remains really bad. Like if you look at the reports by J.J. O'Connell, who's the director of training at the end of the Civil War, he says some of them don't even know how to load the rifle. They don't know how to clean the rifle. The amount of self-inflicted casualties is very high. It's about a third of their casualties. And you've the likes of O'Higgins, who is scathing about the army. And of course, he kind of hangs Mulcahy, the army commander-in-chief, out to dry at the end of the Civil War. And he says the army has been inefficient and it's been a massive waste of money. And they should have brought the Civil War to a close much quicker. So basically, how do you respond to that the National Army succeeds through its size and its mass and not through its kind of excellence of its practice?
No, I agree with you. And I went through all those figures myself. I did go through the UCC fatality rolls because Andy Bieldenberg and John Borganova were my supervisors. They made sure I went through the UCC fatality rolls. And I double-checked them then against what the newspaper said. And then I triple-checked them against the National Army fatality rolls. That hadn't been published yet, John, but now the military archives allowed me to do it. And I sat down and read through the 800 plus names, and I could see well over 100 of them were self-inflicted injuries. And that's where I tied into Ginger O'Connell saying, we need to better train our soldiers. And you can see them saying at the start of the Civil War, some of them were learning the mechanism of a rifle on the ship on their way down to Cork. Like, that's not ideal. But they had to generate and build a national army in the middle of a civil war, which was quite substantial to do. And they did it. And I wouldn't stand here and say that the National Army were a pillar of society at the very end of the Civil War. Were they the best trained army that's ever taken the field? Far from it. Did they have the equipment? They knew how to use the equipment, because you can see Michael Collins writing to Walker at the start of the British Legion saying, I need artillerymen, I need machine gunners, I need aircraft technicians, I need technicians. So a lot of that leadership and that technicality came in from British Army veterans into the National Army. And you can see them when they were downsizing the National Army, they wanted to hold on to these people. They gave those technicians, they couldn't promote them because of political sensitivities, but they gave them extra allowances. They gave them what's called tech pay to allow them to stay on in service and to maintain all the vehicles. So we can see Mahon, I think a letter that he wrote in 1923-24 to the Army Inquiry saying, yeah, we weren't perfect at the start, but discipline certainly improved towards the end of the war. Was it perfect? No. And I can't sit down here and argue with you, John. Was it perfect? Because I know, we both know that it wasn't perfect, but it worked. In the reforms, they battle grouped the infantry. I think the infantry was 37,000, and they battle grouped into, I think it was 68 or 64 battalions that were independent battalions that had their own artillery support, their own medical support, their own signal support, their own transport support. And those battalions worked a whole lot better than they did in the first half of the war. I came across in the National Archives a fantastic after-action review written. It's 9 pages, absolutely amazing. And they go through in detail the performance of each of the battalions. And basically it says these battalions performed a whole lot better than they did at the start of the war than they're doing now with the new battle grouping, the new command and control systems that they've put in, the new placement of the British Army veterans into key positions of leadership. And that was very politically sensitive to do. So we can see that the battalions are performing better at the tactical level at the end of the war. I think the after-action review was written in March, April in the East Kerry, West Cork area around Kenmare, that they came in with a 2,000 strong force, put in a very good cordon, and then they used what were called counter columns came in. And they picked their best soldiers because they knew the IRA flying columns in that terrain were better soldiers than them. So they picked their most experienced soldiers and they formed them into what's called counter columns. And these counter columns, they went in to the area to do the fighting. And then the less, let's just say, the less trained or the not so good soldiers provided the outer cordon as these guys went into the inner cordon and did it. They got more armored vehicles out because they realized the IRA were affecting, and they did it all throughout Afghanistan and Iraq. If you want to affect a base, or the ink blots theory where you're in post, you just cut them off and you affect their freedom of movement. And you can see freedom of movement became an operational or strategic center of gravity in Afghanistan towards the end of the war. So now we see armored vehicles going out to each one of those so as to allow them patrol and move out, because what you want to do in an insurgency is keep the government forces stuck in their headquarters. And you see Ted O'Sullivan writing about that. We're managing to keep them in their posts. We're not allowing them out. We're stopping them from connecting from the population, because the insurgent wants the government forces to stay in the buildings and them to control the countryside, to say, look, they're not here to protect you. We're the only people that can protect you. And like what you're doing in certain places where they're all living in a big fob, and they're moving out and they're spending 10 hours in a local town or village. And then at nighttime, they move back into their big forward operating base. And then the insurgents come back and saying, where are your government forces now to protect you? You can't commute to work. You have to live amongst the population. And towards the end of the conflict, you can see the Free State even in Cork. And I know I concentrate in Cork, but that was my proof of concept. There's 68 bases in Cork occupied by 5,500 National Army soldiers, the majority of who are recruited from Cork, and they have the freedom of movement to operate around. Are they committing atrocities? Yes. Are they committing as much atrocities as were committed in Kerry? No, because they're local soldiers. Kerry was a different war altogether. The Civil War, some say, is continuing in Kerry. My uncle Patsy said to me, the 1975 and 1977 football matches between Dublin and Kerry were a continuation of the Civil War, because they're only a generation or two after that. So yeah, they weren't perfect, John, in any way, but they managed to get over the line at the very end. And O'Higgins wasn't a big supporter of the army throughout the conflict. He didn't want to do it, and he could see himself, and Ernest Bly could see 30% of the budget going on defence. And they wanted to move that away to other areas, similar to what's happening in government now. Everyone is competing for a limited amount of resources. And it was up to the army to stay legitimate. And Mulcahy knew that he couldn't delegitimize his actions by atrocities. So he's trying his best to cut down on the atrocities. Were they perfect at the end of the Civil War? No. Were they a bit better than they were at the start of the Civil War? I would contend, yes.
Gareth, as a career soldier, and we're talking about, the Irish Defence Forces, the National Army at the time, really being forged during the Civil War, and from a standing start, really developing all these different things that you've been talking about. How important is the Army Mutiny in 1924? Could that be said in some ways to be the real birth of civilian control, a proper civilian-led army? Or is that concentrating too much on the Army Mutiny?
A little bit concentrated too much on it. There was a number of areas happened that I would say. Michael Collins being killed in August 22. He was pretty much everything, and he had no official titles. He had so many titles. He was like a generalissimo, as they called him. He was the man. He did finance. He was commander-in-chief of the army. Correct me if I'm wrong, John, but he wasn't chief of staff. So he was everything. Like commander-in-chief of the army is the president. So he was president, he was finance minister, he was everything. So when he died, it became more decentralized. And this is where O'Higgins and Bly and Cosgrave saw their chance to come in and take civilian control. Because at the start of the Civil War, the army was the only functioning instrument of the state. And now how functioning it was, we can debate all evening. But it was one of the few. They built up a civic guard then afterwards, and they got governance, and they did. But the army provided the first pillar to build all that upon. Did it become very powerful? Yes, it did at the start of the Civil War. With the death of Collins, it lost a bit of its power. With the fact that Mulcahy wanted to hand over and become a democratic pillar of the society, that fed into the narrative then for civilian control. You can see Mulcahy writing about that, saying, we are an instrument of the state. If we want to be a proper democracy, we can't be led. You can see the Spanish Civil War, Franco kept power, and it took years for that to move away. The National Army handed over control to the government after the Civil War perfectly. 1924, the mutiny, that was the clearing out of the old guard out of the army, the old IRA, the IRA organization that had been in the army, that had fought for Irish independence. I can see both sides of the story. They were very disenfranchised. as a professional army officer, do I appreciate when professional army officers and NCOs come in to run an organization? Yes, I do. Is it hard for people who fought for independence to see guys who, for veterans of World War I, staying in the job and them losing their job? Of course it is. And that's what the mutiny was. But like, the mutiny was a damn squib at the end of it all. But it was a wake-up call for the governments that how to control the army, because it was a big instrument of the state. I would say 1932, when Fianna Fáil took power, is a huge moment in the history of the National Army, because as the Free State generals turned to Mulcahy and says, we fought these guys 10 years ago and we defeated them 10 years ago, and now they're taking control of us. And Mulcahy, and they said, do we shoot or do we salute? And Mulcahy says, the people have spoken. There has been an election. Democracy has spoken. They are now the new government and we are servants of the people. And I think 1932 was the key moment where government control over the army took place.
For foreign observers of military theory, observing the Irish Civil War, are there lessons that they can draw?
Yes, I would say there are a huge amount of lessons, and that's the whole idea of my book. And I want all the foreign militaries to buy my book and learn from the examples of what the Free State Army did. Did they know they were conducting the theory of clear hole build? No, they didn't, because it hadn't been invented by them. Did they know how to do it by common sense? Yes, and that's the remarkable thing, that young army officers in their 20s and 30s knew. And one of the big things we were being taught in America when I was there in the middle of the Afghanistan war was common sense is not so common. That's what Voltaire used to say. To believe in common sense, to believe in critical thinking, to be able to think outside the box, to come up with innovative solutions. And that's the key areas. So that's why I've broken my book down, John, into clear hole build. I'm trying to do two things, and maybe I'm not succeeding in either of them. I'm trying to be a historical book of the Civil War, but I'm also trying to teach lessons to outside organizations, how to conduct a counterinsurgency. Was it perfect? No, and we've discussed that for the last year. Did it work at the end? Yes. And how many counterinsurgencies have worked at the very end? No. I think Malaya, as the American officers said in Iraq, we're tired of listening about Malaya. So I'm hoping that they'll now want to listen about the Irish Civil War. And I've seen a lot of stuff on social media now where American academics are coming out and supporting my book. Is it perfect? No. But it gives an example to foreign militaries how to do the hold and the build. And as General Petraeus said, he said that they were doing clear and hold and they weren't doing the build at the very start of the conflict. But Petraeus, him and John Nagle, who wrote the foreword to the book, it was the build that's what turns the tactical victories into strategic successes. It's winning over the population. The Civil War could have been over by September if Dalton and O'Duffy had got on with each other and had coordinated a little bit better and had moved into North Cork and stopped that ungoverned space that happened in North Cork, West Cork, Kerry area. And we see Jacqueline Hazeltine writing in her book about counterinsurgencies that it's the ungoverned spaces is where counterinsurgencies thrive. And it's how to counter these ungoverned spaces that I believe the National Army and Free State did very well in the Civil War. Were they perfect? No. Did they uphold to the clear hold build? Yeah, surprisingly they did. Did they know what they were doing? They knew in a common sense perspective what they were doing. They weren't following a playbook, as the Americans would say. But it was the build that won over the population and actually brought peace to Ireland for decades afterwards. And we removed the Civil War to the political sphere where it should be, where we had the Civil War parties against each other in a democratic way, rather than it never returned to violence. The IRA never took their guns out of the hiding places. Okay, they did a little bit in the 1930s. They did a little bit with Sean South-Garryon, and then we had the 60s and the Troubles, which was whatever. But down in, we hear the people of Cork wanting to be a republic, but I think it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I still think they're happy to be Irish. So overall, I'm hoping that foreign militaries can learn a huge amount from the leadership of the National Army. And I think the Irish Civil War and the counterinsurgency tactics of the National Army is a really, really good example of how the clear hold philosophy, how the host nation supports, how the civil control, the civil governance, and the most important thing is the restoration of essential services, the rebuilding of the economy, and the rebuilding of the governance. It's how to make a safe and secure environment that stops the war starting again. If we see in the Middle East and if we see in other areas, they win the kinetic engagements, and then they're surprised when they kick off again 10, 20 years' time, because all they've done is given root cause for more insurgencies to stop afterwards. It's to cut out the cause. It's to win the information battle. They're the key elements of an insurgency, which I believe the Free State did remarkably well.
Well, Gareth, thank you very much for coming on the show today. That was Colonel Gareth Prendergast. He's the head of Strategic Force Design for the Irish Defence Forces, and his book, Clear, Hold and Build, is available now. Just like to say, if you'd like to check out our friends at radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions, you'll find the link in our notes, and you can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at IrishHistoryPod, or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. If you hear a podcast you like, please share it on your social media. We are really grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners. The Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story is included as a link in the show notes. And if you would consider supporting the show, please click on the link. And we appreciate so much all the people who have clicked already and supported us. So on behalf of myself, Cathal Brennan, and my co-host, John Dorney, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.